With Resident Evil 7, Capcom took its long-running survival horror franchise in bold new directions while simultaneously taking it back to its horror roots. Despite Resident Evil 7 using a first-person perspective, the game was still very much a classic Resident Evil title, seemingly taking inspiration from the original Resident Evil with its setting and puzzles. Resident Evil Village continues what Resident Evil 7 started by retaining the first-person view, but this time takes inspiration from more action-oriented games in the series. In this video we are discussing the whole events of Resident Evil Village. The events happened before, during and would happen after the Village events, and I will be also taking a special analysis on my man, Chris Redfield. Set a few years after the events of Resident Evil 7, protagonist Ethan Winters and his wife Mia have settled down in a rural European town, where they have tried to live a normal life with their baby daughter Rose. Unfortunately, their peace doesn't last too long, and after a shocking confrontation with series veteran Chris Redfield, Ethan finds himself stranded in a mountain village with his daughter in the clutches of the villainous mother Miranda and her four lords. Resident Evil Village's rural European setting immediately calls to mind Resident Evil 4, and the similarities between the two games don't stop there. Everything from Resident Evil Village's inventory system to its greater focus on action callback to Leon's groundbreaking adventure. But since Ethan wasn't all that combat savvy in Resident Evil 7, some fans may be wondering why he's all of a sudden mowing down hordes of enemies in the new game. The game serves as the next major installment in the Resident Evil franchise, and will see the return of the franchise's major mascot, Chris Redfield. And Ethan Winters in the first-person gameplay of Resident Evil 7, which is a first for a mainline Resident Evil game. It is no secret that the story of Resident Evil Village is closely linked to its predecessor, taking place just a few years after Ethan Winters survived the Bakers. However, going into Resident Evil Village without playing Resident Evil may 7th find themselves overwhelmed with everything that is going on. Here is a quick breakdown of every important plot point in Resident Evil 7 that players should know before Resident Evil Village. As such, this post will heavily feature major Resident Evil 7 spoilers. Resident Evil 7 featured Ethan Winters, who is the first protagonist in a mainline Resident Evil game that was not involved in the Raccoon City saga, except Resident Evil SIX's Piers Nievans, Jake Muller, and Helena Harper, who were semi-protagonists. Given that Resident Evil 7 featured a brand new protagonist, most of the game's story is not directly linked to its predecessors apart from the basic concept of having a shady company conducting biological research. After receiving a cryptic video from his missing wife, Mia, Ethan traveled to Dulvey, Louisiana, where he stumbled upon the Baker family's home. Upon exploring the house, Ethan found Mia, but soon discovered that she, and the rest of the Baker family, are infected with a new bioweapon known as the mold. Throughout the game, Ethan explores Baker's mansion in search of a cure for Mia, and after curing her of the mold, Ethan discovered that his wife works for a mysterious group known as the Connections. Under their employ, Mia was tasked to care for a new bioweapon known as Evelyn, who appeared to look like a 10-year-old girl. It was later revealed that Evelyn could control the mold and everyone infected with it. After defeating members of the Baker family, Ethan had a final showdown with Evelyn. He was able to neutralize her with the help of a weapon dropped from a helicopter by Blue Umbrella. The end of Resident Evil 7 revealed that series veteran Chris Redfield led the rescue of Ethan and Mia Winters. Interestingly enough, Redfield was revealed to be working with Blue Umbrella, and his involvement in the game was further explored in the DLC, Not a Hero. After rescuing Ethan and Mia Winters, Chris pursued Lucas Baker, who was able to escape in the main game, in an attempt to stop him before he can transmit data regarding the mold and Evelyn's progress to the Connections. Throughout the DLC, Chris appeared to have been in a conflicted state. It was revealed that Chris is struggling with having to work with Blue Umbrella. For the uninitiated, Blue Umbrella is the reformed version of the original Umbrella Corporation, which now conducts research on weapons against bioterrorism. Despite its reformed state, Chris distrusts Blue Umbrella, noting that he does not see himself as a hero, but as a man who is capable of doing bad things to achieve good. While the Not a Hero DLC was brief, it was enough to show just how much Chris Redfield has changed throughout the series. In early trailers for Resident Evil Village, Chris has been portrayed as a villain, especially after shooting Mia Winters in front of Ethan before abducting their baby daughter, Rose. While Chris's true intentions are still unclear, Resident Evil 7's Not a Hero DLC was able to foreshadow the events that could ultimately lead to him doing bad things. Whether his questionable actions are for the sake of achieving good remains to be seen. As far as Ethan Winters is concerned, Resident Evil Village will revolve around him trying to save his daughter from danger. It remains unclear why Chris Redfield abducted his daughter. But it is possible that the baby had remnants of the mold in her body, which she could have gotten from Mia's previous infection in Resident Evil 7. It's implied that Ethan has been getting intensive training from Chris Redfield in the years since Resident Evil 7's conclusion to prepare him in case he ever found himself in another life-threatening situation. Ethan puts those skills to good use in Resident Evil Village, utilizing a deeper arsenal of weapons as he fights against crazed villagers, wolf-like creatures called lycans, and some other monsters that he bumps into in his search for his daughter. Anyone that felt Resident Evil 7 didn't have enough action will likely be much happier with Resident Evil Village in that regard, as there's a lot more shooting and many more enemy types for Ethan to contend with. Unfortunately, there is something lost with this renewed focus on action over scares. Capcom itself has admitted that Resident Evil Village isn't as scary as Resident Evil 7, and that will be readily apparent to anyone that plays through it. There are a couple of startling moments, but the game doesn't seem concerned with making players truly afraid of anything. None of the monsters pose that significant of a threat to Ethan, and even the bosses are dispatched rather easily. The biggest letdown in this regard is easily Lady Dimitrescu. Heavily featured in the game's promotional materials, Resident Evil Village's Lady Dimitrescu has become the face of the new game, even though her role is overall not that significant in the grand scheme of things. Much has been said about how Lady Dimitrescu stalks Ethan around her castle like Mr. X from Resident Evil 2, but once it becomes clear that Ethan can easily outrun and outmaneuver her, she becomes infinitely less intimidating. Gameplay-wise, Resident Evil Village's villains are a step down from Resident Evil 7's Baker family, but in terms of lore, they are more interesting. Each of Mother Miranda's lords also has a unique look to them and special powers that come into play in their section of the game world. This results in varied environments and engaging cutscenes, even if players may come away feeling like these supposedly ultra-powerful beings are pushovers. They may not be all that compelling to fight, but it is fun learning more about Lady Dimitrescu and the game's other lords. While players are out slaughtering Resident Evil Village's villains and monsters, they will also be doing a great deal of exploration. The village in the game's title serves as a sort of hub area that branches off into each major section of the game. As players progress through the story, they will get new keys and other items that will allow them to explore the village further, turning up treasures and special weapons that will give them an even greater edge over their enemies. Treasures and other points of interest are marked on the map at a certain point in the game, making it easy for Resident Evil Village players to check out all the side content. When compared to most other games in the series, there's quite a bit of side content in Resident Evil Village, which, combined with new game plus and multiple difficulty levels, boosts the game's replay value significantly. One drawback when it comes to Resident Evil Village's hub area is that it can become easy to get lost, and even when referencing the map, it's not always clear how to get to where players need to go. This is an issue a couple of times in the game as well, and it really serves to grind the pacing down to a halt. However, players should be able to find their way back to the right path with enough running around. Even if players do get lost in Resident Evil Village, at least they will have plenty of pretty scenery to look at. Resident Evil Village uses ray tracing to great effect on next-generation consoles, with its lighting easily the most impressive thing about it visually. The game is not a mind-blowing next-gen graphics showcase like one may have hoped, but it still looks fantastic, and is the best-looking Resident Evil game to date. Resident Evil Village's gorgeous graphics go hand in hand with its impressive level of polish, with zero technical issues or visual hiccups of any kind encountered during our time with the game. To sweeten the pot, Resident Evil Village has virtually no load times and runs perfectly, on the PS5 at least. Resident Evil Village is a huge step forward when it comes to graphics and general performance, but it also makes some important quality of life improvements that fans will appreciate. A big one is that Resident Evil Village lets players skip cutscenes, which was not always possible in its predecessor. This makes replaying Resident Evil Village a much more appealing prospect, and is another big boost for its replay value. Resident Evil Village can be completed in about 8 hours on a first playthrough, though it's possible to beat it in under 3 hours as well. Nearly every Resident Evil game is short, but they make up for it by giving players good reasons to go back through the game. Resident Evil Village's replay value is through the roof, with a ton of unlockable content like the Returning Mercenaries mode giving players even more to do once they've wrapped up the main story. Resident Evil Village brings Mercenaries mode back, challenging players to kill as many enemies as possible within a certain time limit in stages pulled from the main game. The mode isn't quite as fully featured as it was in previous games, but it's still a fun enough diversion, and is good for anyone who wants a quick fix of Resident Evil Village's combat without diving into the story again. Resident Evil Village's story is somewhat of a mixed bag. There are elements to it that will have players rolling their eyes as it can't help but fall into the same old Resident Evil cliches for many of its story beats. But at the same time, Resident Evil Village also makes some rather bold moves, setting up the inevitable Resident Evil 9 to potentially have an especially interesting story whenever it comes out. Resident Evil Village doesn't have the most engrossing or satisfying story in Resident Evil history, and its more action-oriented approach is likely to disappoint fans that enjoyed RE7's pure horror. However, Resident Evil Village is packed with replay value, rarely has a dull moment, and should leave Resident Evil fans excited for the franchise's future. Resident Evil Village is full of nods to other games in the series, and is actually an incredibly important title in terms of the overarching storyline that started with the first game back in 1996. Some of Resident Evil Village's nods to past games in the series are cute little Easter eggs or throwaway lines, but others have huge ramifications for the franchise as a whole. Please note that in order to discuss Resident Evil Village's connections to other Resident Evil games, it's necessary to delve deep into spoiler territory. So anyone that doesn't want Resident Evil Village spoilers should turn back now. Resident Evil Village connects to the original Resident Evil game in a number of ways. Besides including Chris Redfield, one of the protagonists of the original Resident Evil games, Village also makes direct reference to Oswald E. Spencer, the founder of Umbrella, who built the mansion from that game. Spencer later appeared in Resident Evil 5 DLC, where he was murdered by Albert Wesker. Despite playing such an important role in the franchise's story, fans don't really spend much time with Spencer in the games, but they learn more about him through a file in Resident Evil Village. Near the end of Resident Evil Village, Chris finds files detailing the origins of all of Mother Miranda's lords, along with a note from none other than Oswald E. Spencer. As it turns out, Spencer learned under Mother Miranda, and even modeled the Umbrella logo and name from a symbol that the two of them found in a cave. Spencer talks to Mother Miranda in the note about finding a virus in Africa, which is what would eventually lead to the creation of the T-virus and kick off the events of the Resident Evil series. In most of the Resident Evil games, the Umbrella Corporation serves as the primary antagonist. It's the Umbrella Corporation that creates the T-virus and causes the Raccoon City incident, where the entire city was overrun with zombies. Umbrella's impact on the world was still felt long after the company was shut down, directly causing a variety of other catastrophes with bioweapons around the world. Resident Evil 7 ignored the Umbrella Corporation almost entirely, except for the end of the game where it was revealed that Chris Redfield was working for a reworked version of the corporation known as Blue Umbrella. And then in the marketing materials for Resident Evil Village, Capcom was sure to show fans that the game featured some kind of stone structure with the Umbrella logo on it, hinting that the corporation would have a role to play in the new game. It doesn't take long to find the Umbrella logo in the game. The Umbrella logo is the center of the altar that players visit after every boss fight, and it's where they add the different pieces of Ethan's daughter Rose, who has been separated into flasks. The Umbrella logo is the centerpiece of the altar, and so it's clear from the get-go that it has some kind of greater meaning in the grand scheme of things. After Resident Evil Village players successfully add all of the Rose flasks to the altar, they will get the Giant's Chalice. With the Giant's Chalice in tow, Resident Evil Village players can then make their way to the ceremony site and gain access to Heisenberg's factory. So while this is where players see the Umbrella logo in Resident Evil Village, it doesn't do much to explain exactly why the Umbrella logo is there. The file in question was written by Oswell E. Spencer, the founder of Umbrella. In the letter, Spencer talks about how he was mentored by Mother Miranda, and how the two of them discovered the umbrella symbol in a cave. Spencer's work with Mother Miranda is what ultimately inspires him to conduct the research that eventually leads to the T-virus, which is what kicked off the entire Resident Evil storyline to begin with. Essentially, Spencer studied under Mother Miranda, and he was inspired by the umbrella symbol that the two of them found in his creation of Umbrella the company. This revelation also goes a long way in better connecting both Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village to the previous games in the franchise, as it directly connects the black mold to the overarching Resident Evil storyline. No black mold, no T-virus, no umbrella. It all revolves around Mother Miranda and the research that she conducted while trying to bring her dead daughter Eva back from the dead. In Resident Evil Village's ending, Ethan Winters stays behind to sacrifice himself, allowing Chris Redfield to escape with Ethan's daughter Rose and wife Mia. Ethan's death is a huge moment in Resident Evil Village, but it's quickly followed up by a new startling revelation. As Chris Redfield and everyone else escape on the helicopter, his team brings aboard what is believed to be a dead BSAA soldier. BSAA, for those who may not remember, is the organization dedicated to fighting bioweapons that Chris Redfield used to work for. For reasons that still haven't been fully explained, Chris left the BSAA organization between the events of Resident Evil 6 and Resident Evil 7. As it turns out, the dead BSAA soldier was really a bioweapon. It seems as though the BSAA has started using bioweapons to fight fire with fire, so to speak, and Redfield is not happy about it. This revelation has Chris ask the helicopter pilot to take him straight to the BSAA headquarters in Europe so that he can get to the bottom of the situation. With this, it seems as though the BSAA will be the new evil organization that the heroes in Resident Evil have to contend with. Umbrella has not only been dissolved, but fans now know exactly where the company originated from. Perhaps Umbrella will still have some kind of an impact in future Resident Evil games, but that remains to be seen. As RE Village's Miranda reveals, she discovered the mold as part of her efforts to revive her daughter Eva, who perished due to the Spanish flu. The original mold in Eastern Europe mutated with Miranda upon death, seemingly granting her immortality. Soon, Miranda surmised that she can experiment with the mold to create a host for her reborn Eva. She indoctrinated students, chief among them the four lords of the village, into experimenting with the village's inhabitants. One of her students, Oswell Spencer, believed in the capabilities of the mold to help humanity evolve, thus motivating his eugenics efforts. Spencer eventually formed Umbrella, using the Lord's crest as its logo. To accelerate her own experiments, Miranda gave samples of the virus to the Connections and the HCF, the military arm of Umbrella's unnamed rival. From the 1990s and across the years, the Connections would create unsuccessful BAO prototypes named A-types through D-types. While directly not in between the games, this background info remains essential to build context. Granted, Umbrella Corps as a multiplayer game meant there aren't any significant events to affect the overarching plot of the series. However, its premise does pose implications to the timeline. After the global bioterrorist attacks spanning 2012 to 2013, RE6, bioterrorism trade skyrocketed in the black market. With their threats too great for organizations like the BSAA to contain, infected districts as of 2015 were simply put on lockdown. This is where Umbrella Corps players taking the role of zombie hunters of various organizations roam around, hunt zombies, and take samples for their benefactors. These hunters, mostly formidable mercenaries, use a technologically enhanced arsenal to conduct their missions. Perhaps before or during the events of Umbrella Corps, the Connections developed their E-type prototype BAO from Miranda's mold samples. Nicknamed Evelyn, this BAO fully realizes the megamycete fungus's potential, mind control. In turn, Evelyn eliminates the need for violence in conducting missions. After all, Evelyn can simply control the minds of its hosts. This effectively disrupted the black market trade for bioweapons. However, it's still unknown if she can fulfill her purpose in becoming Eva's host. After her creation, Mia Winters, an agent of the Connections at the time, is tasked to transfer Evelyn to another facility when a storm sinks their ship near Louisiana. In a DLC, set up as a tape recording from Zoe in 2014, describes her last night with her real family. Throughout the minigame, we see how a recently rescued Evelyn slowly infected the Baker family into adoring her through her mold. Fixated with a desire to create the perfect family, Evelyn tasked the Bakers into kidnapping tourists and locals for her. Their activities attracted national attention by 2016. This string of kidnappings ended when Evelyn instructed Mia to lure her husband Ethan Winters into the house to transform her into a father figure. It's safe to assume that the escalating events in 2016 also led Blue Umbrella to them as well. Despite being a stage play with its own plot, Biohazard the Experience offers insights into the world at large. The play begins as 13 strangers wake up in a zombie-infested mansion in 2015, with no recollection of how they got there. Soon, they realize their stay is due to an experiment courtesy of an unknown company. Apparently, the group's sole survivor should end up as a viable vessel for the tyrant virus. By the time they mutate, the company will sell them to the highest bidder. Given its date, the private company in the experience is similar to bioterror companies beyond Umbrella. These groups, such as the Connections, aim to create new types of bioweapons. Essentially, events in Not a Hero happen shortly after the main events of RE7. As fans recall, Blue Umbrella asked the BSAA to send Chris Redfield to deal with the events at the Baker house. After saving Ethan and Mia, Chris embarks on his actual mission. In it, Chris is tasked to apprehend Lucas Baker, as data suggests he's working for the Connections. However, it seems Lucas has plans to send files on Evelyn to yet another third party. Chris manages to kill Lucas and stop the transfer, but he doesn't get to uncover the name of the aforementioned third party. With his current objective finished, Blue Umbrella calls Chris for yet another urgent mission. If Not a Hero is played before End of Zoe, it's implied that Chris may have been called to assist fighting the Molded and save Zoe. Regardless, Chris implies throughout the DLC that whatever transpired after RE6 drastically changed his view of the world. Around 2018, Chris starts viewing the BSAA as a corrupt organization and distances himself from them. Given his influence as a high-ranking operator, other members follow in his suit. In turn, they form a paramilitary force called the Hound Wolf Squad operating outside the jurisdiction of the BSAA. This rogue unit consists of Chris alongside 5 other members: K9, Umber Eyes, Tundra, Lobo, and Night Howl. As former BSAA agents, each of them are trained operatives capable of undertaking special missions. It's implied they began investigating about the true nature of the mold after the Baker House incident. At some point after RE7, Chris relocates the Winters family somewhere in Eastern Europe for their safety. At this time, Ethan took basic military training to protect his family in times of danger. Soon, in 2020, Ethan and Mia has a child, Rosemary Winters. Throughout flashbacks, Ethan and Mia appear to have Rosemary sent in for tests in laboratories due to her special nature. After all, both Ethan and Mia had interactions with the mold. At this time, the Connections also reported to Miranda about Evelyn's incompatibility as Eva's new host. However, the group also reported about the existence of Rosemary. Under the orders of Chris, the Hound Wolf Squad began doing research of their own regarding the nature of the mold. At some point, they have done reconnaissance at the Mojave Desert, which somehow revealed Miranda's existence and her plan. The Hound Wolves discover that Miranda believes Rosemary can become the final means through which Eva can be reborn. In turn, they discover that Miranda will make a move soon to try and procure Rosemary from the Winters family. It's around this time that Chris will orchestrate a plan to attack the Winters family and kill Mia, who he knows will be Miranda's disguise to acquire Rosemary. Unbeknownst to Chris, Miranda has already put her plan to action. Thanks to the mold, Miranda also received shape-shifting abilities. Before the events of RE Village, Miranda manages to have Mia Winters kidnapped and locked in the village. In turn, Miranda herself shapeshifts into Mia to acquire Rosemary and slowly lure the family into the village. This explains the prologue, Mia telling stories about the village to the infant Rosemary. However, Miranda's plans go awry when Chris attacks and seemingly kills her in her Mia disguise. She strikes a counterattack when she assaults Ethan and Rosemary's convoy to kidnap the child. Knowing Ethan would somehow try to reacquire Rosemary, she begins the process of reviving Eva immediately. Just like in the Resident Evil Village reveal trailer, the game starts with Chris Redfield arriving at Ethan Winter's house, gunning down Mia. Chris and his team then capture Ethan and Rose, Ethan and Mia's baby, and try to leave. However, things go south when Mia reawakens in the transport vehicle and causes a wreck. Ethan then sets out to look for Rose, investigating a nearby mountain village. Chris isn't seen for most of the rest of the game until much later on, when he explains everything to Ethan. According to Chris, who he thought was Mia was really Resident Evil Village villain Mother Miranda, who has the power to shapeshift into different forms. Mother Miranda was trying to kidnap Rose for herself, as she is trying to resurrect her own daughter using Rose's body as a vessel. Rose is connected to the black mold from Resident Evil 7, which in turn is what has given Mother Miranda her powers and immortality, and so that makes her an ideal candidate for Miranda's dead daughter Eva. It is also said that the mutamycete fungi can store consciousness in it, so it makes sense for Miranda to search for a perfect host to correlate with the consciousness of Eva. After Ethan is seemingly killed by Miranda, players then take on the role of Chris Redfield for themselves. Chris and his team infiltrate the village, gunning down all kinds of lichens and other creatures. Redfield successfully arms explosives on the megamycete, which is what is powering the black mold and Mother Miranda. He then discovers more about Mother Miranda's origins and even manages to save the real Mia, who had been kept prisoner and experimented on. A revived Ethan then continues his pursuit of Miranda, with Redfield helping Ethan in the fight. Chris is then blocked off and Ethan has to finish the fight against Mother Miranda on his own. Ethan is mortally wounded in the battle, and he entrusts Rose with Chris. Ethan sacrifices himself to destroy the megamycete as Chris, Mia, Rose, and the surviving members of Chris's team escape on a helicopter. Aboard the helicopter, Chris realizes that the BSAA soldiers sent in were actually bioweapons and not real soldiers. This could give some insight into why Chris has been working with the Blue Umbrella organization and has jumped ship from the BSAA. Perhaps Chris did not agree with some of the decisions that the organization was making. The game then ends with Chris mentoring Ethan's daughter Rose while also traveling to the BSAA headquarters to figure out what's going on for himself. So the short answer is that no, Chris Redfield is not a villain in Resident Evil Village. Redfield is briefly teased to be taking a villainous turn at the start of the game, but it doesn't take long for players to realize that Chris is not actually evil. Redfield is simply investigating the Mother Miranda situation, and is trying to keep Ethan and his family safe. And he does not turn into a werewolf or any other kind of monster during the events of the game. He comes out of the end of it relatively unscathed. Chris Redfield survives the events of Resident Evil Village, and it seems he survives for some time after that as well. There is a time skip after the end of Resident Evil Village that shows a grown-up Rose visiting Ethan's grave. It's possible that Rose ages faster than normal humans, though that is not explicitly stated. Assuming she ages like normal, then it seems that Chris would likely be in his 50s by the time the game takes place. Considering this, it seems that an aged Chris Redfield could very well be featured in the inevitable Resident Evil 9, but we will have to stand by for more information on that front. There are some cool Easter eggs in the village, such as, Resident Evil Village doesn't make many nods to Resident Evil 2, unless one wants to count Lady Dimitrescu behaving like Mr. X as one. However, the beginning of the game does make a direct reference to a character from Resident Evil 2, the gun shop owner Robert Kendo. While walking around Ethan's house at the beginning of the game, players can check out his bookshelf, where they can find a book written by Kendo. It seems that this was part of Ethan's training between the events of Resident Evil 7 and Village, and helps to explain how he is now much more proficient with firearms in the new game. Since the remake of Resident Evil 2 stands as one of the best-selling in the entire franchise, it should come as no surprise to fans that they would find an Easter egg related to the game. It's also not the first time that the Kendo name has resurfaced in subsequent games. They are of course responsible for creating the S.T.A. or handgun known as the Samurai's Edge. This is highlighted in Resident Evil 4, when Leon's starter pistol is inscribed with the words Kendo Custom Shop. Players can find a book entitled A Historical Look into the Architecture of Eastern European Castles and Keeps by George Trevor. Of course, this is an even older reference to the original Resident Evil game, as George Trevor is the architect responsible for designing the Spencer Mansion in which the majority of the original game takes place. The book's title is likely a nod to the oddly medieval, Gothic overtones found in the interior of the Spencer Mansion. While the debate about which early Resident Evil game is the best continues, it's exciting to see the latest iteration of the franchise harken back to its beginnings. Since Resident Evil Village has only been out for a very short period of time, there is likely a whole slew of references that have yet to be unearthed. Still, the mere fact that 2 references can be found on a single bookshelf should be enough to spur us into searching for more. Resident Evil Village is inspired by Resident Evil 4, and so as one might imagine, there are a ton of references to the game. The general aesthetic of Resident Evil Village is similar to Resident Evil 4, as both games are set in gloomy, rural European areas. The games both have giant fish monsters that players have to fight, and they both feature castles. They also both let players kill animals for meat. The list goes on. But a more direct reference comes from Resident Evil Village's The Duke character, who plays the role of the merchant in the new game. The Duke in Resident Evil Village quotes the merchant from Resident Evil 4 at certain points in the game, and even goes as far as to refer to him as an old friend. Their relationship isn't explored beyond that line, but perhaps that is something that we will learn more about in the future. Spencer's trip to Africa is a big focus of Resident Evil 5, as that game takes place entirely in Africa, and is about exploring the origins of the various viruses that have plagued humanity since the first Resident Evil game. However, there is another reference to Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil Village beyond the Spencer note, and it comes in the form of a joke said by one of Mother Miranda's lords. While Resident Evil Village players are fighting Heisenberg, he talks about Chris Redfield, referencing Redfield's infamous boulder punching moment. As some may recall, the end of Resident Evil 5 saw Redfield literally punching boulders during the boss fight with Albert Wesker, which is one of the moments that have been mocked endlessly by fans of the franchise. So now let's talk about the 4 lords. The village has historically been ruled by 4 noble families, the Beneviento, Moria, Heisenberg, and Dimitrescu. While all the families appear in Resident Evil Village, it's the denizens of Castle Dimitrescu that have most captured the gaming community's attention. Lady Alcina Dimitrescu, Countess and matriarch of the Dimitrescu family, has basically become the face of Resident Evil Village. This was encouraged through the game's promotional art and trailers, driving fans' fascination with the character. Many people refer to Lady Dimitrescu as a vampire, and while she does have vampiric traits, that's not the whole story. To find out what she really is, we have to go deep into Resident Evil Village's plot. While we don't have an exact date of birth for Lady Dimitrescu, we can guess that she was most likely born sometime in the early 1900s. In her mortal life she suffered from a hereditary blood disease, until she came into contact with Mother Miranda in the 1950s. The primary antagonist of Resident Evil Village, Mother Miranda, is a scientist, priestess, and mutant. She infected Lady Dimitrescu with a bioorganic weapon called a Kadu, which granted the Countess superhuman healing, strength and immortality. The downside of the Kadu is that it also required her to consume large amounts of human blood and flesh to survive. It's this consumption that led Lady Dimitrescu to grow to her impressive height of 9 feet 6 inches. A few years after her own transformation, Lady Dimitrescu used the Kadu parasite's eggs to create 3 daughters. These were insectoid creatures that could take on the form of human women, that she named Daniela, Bella, and Cassandra. Like Lady Dimitrescu, the 3 daughters had similar powers, and relied on human blood and flesh for sustenance. However, they could also turn into swarms of insects, but were incapable of surviving cold temperatures. This left them trapped in Castle Dimitrescu, unlike their mother. On the surface, Lady Dimitrescu's vampiric traits are rather obvious. Firstly, she has 3 of the powers most commonly associated with vampirism: enhanced strength, immortality, and rapid healing. In addition, she requires human blood to survive, which she drinks mixed with red wine to form a concoction called sanguis virginis, Latin for virgin's blood. This drawback was a result of her pre-existing blood condition. Another compelling argument for Lady Dimitrescu's vampiric status is the number of references to famous vampire stories that have been woven into her own. Not the least of which is her home in Castle Dimitrescu, a Romanian fortress which bears a striking similarity to Count Dracula's famous home in Transylvania, which is itself a region of Romania. Her three daughters are also a reference to the most famous vampire in fiction, as Dracula shares his home with three sisters who prey upon visitors. Finally, Lady Dimitrescu's drink of choice, virgin's blood, refers to a popular trope that vampires prefer the blood of virgins to all others. Although it's certainly true that Lady Dimitrescu has several vampiric traits, whether she can be thought of as a true vampire is less certain. Firstly, there's the method by which she gained her powers. In folklore, vampires are traditionally sired by another vampire, who passes on their powers through allowing the victim to drink their blood. If there is an original vampire, they generally gain their powers by being cursed by God or another supernatural entity. By comparison, Lady Dimitrescu is more like Mr. X from the previous Resident Evil. As far as we can tell, Lady Dimitrescu also seems to have none of the traditional vampiric weaknesses. There are many different things that can seriously harm a vampire in fiction, including sunlight, garlic, holy symbols, and holy water. Although it's stated that Lady Dimitrescu and her daughters are sensitive to sunlight, the entire final portion of her boss battle in Resident Evil Village takes place outside the castle during the day. Another argument that Lady Dimitrescu isn't a vampire comes from her consumption of flesh. While drinking human blood is pretty much the core vampiric trait, actually consuming flesh is rarely associated with it. There may be hundreds of different representations of vampires in fiction, but there are some rules that they must share to be considered true vampires. Overall, it seems that while Lady Dimitrescu certainly displays many vampiric traits, she can't be called a true vampire in Resident Evil Village. Her lack of the core weaknesses, and the unique mutation-based method which gave her her powers are enough to disqualify her. In a note found in Lady Dimitrescu's room, it's revealed that the seemingly fearless leader still has her fair share of insecurities. Although standing as one of the four lords of the village, she feels as if she is deserving of much more respect than her fellow leaders. Lady Dimitrescu despises being held to the same level of respect as Heisenberg, especially, disregarding him as childish and irresponsible. Lady Dimitrescu shows a bit of relatable vulnerability in her private journal as she writes about how grateful she is for her castle, daughters, and everlasting life given to her by Mother Miranda, and that she feels deeply about being their leader's favorite. But Heisenberg is Mother Miranda's favorite, as you can see in several instances she favors Heisenberg. Next up is Beneviento. Donna Beneviento is perhaps the most mysterious character in all of Resident Evil Village. Based on our first meeting with her, shortly after Heisenberg captures Ethan, many assume that she's a living doll, but the reality is much more dangerous. Donna is actually a doll maker, one of the proud creators from the famous Beneviento clan. The doll seen with her often is a Beneviento creation and acts as a vessel for the real mastermind, Donna herself. Her outfit of choice makes her even more mysterious. Donna dresses in all-black funeral attire with a black veil to match. In fact, most players won't even know what she looks like until they spot a painting of her in the Beneviento estate. Thanks to her shrouded nature and desire to self-isolate, it's easy to understand why players might not know much about her. At one point, House Beneviento was a prominent and powerful house. A noble family, the Benevientos ruled the region alongside the Dimitrescu, Moreau, and Heisenberg houses. They were renowned for their doll-making skills and built a palatial estate high in the mountains, overlooking a picturesque waterfall. Their lives and themes were very much mired in fantasy, as beautiful and haunting as the dolls they would create. But life wasn't as easy for Donna Beneviento when she was a child. Thanks to a scar on her face, Donna kept herself isolated from the other children and spent most of her time hiding away inside the Beneviento estate. It didn't take long for the effects of Donna's self-isolation to get a grip on her impressionable psyche. Because she had zero human interaction aside from her busy family, she began to create her own fantasy world at home, referring to the dolls as her friends. One particular doll, Angie, became the subject of her obsession, and Donna began to use her as an extension of herself, taking the term imaginary friend to a disturbingly real level. Donna's bitterness towards others and isolation from society continued into her adult years. As the numbers in House Beneviento dwindled and time marched on, Donna's psyche cracked even further. By the time she was the only one left alive in her family, she was so far gone that she completely shut herself off from the outside world, choosing to live in solitude with her beloved Angie. That is, until Mother Miranda discovered her and adopted her as one of her own children, making her one of the 4 lords in the process. Mother Miranda would go on to imbue Donna with the Kadu, giving her powerful abilities. Thanks to the gift from Mother Miranda, Donna unlocked some unique abilities. For one, she became capable of communicating through her doll, Angie. The act is like a supercharged version of ventriloquism, where she can possess the doll, taking control of her limbs and speaking through her. She's also capable of creating powerful hallucinogens, as Ethan finds out when making his way to House Beneviento for the first time. By altering the plants that line the path to her property, Donna was able to create startlingly real hallucinations in Ethan's mind, when the pollens of the flowers touch him, in which he would see his wife Mia and their child, Rose. Donna is an incredibly smart individual, which makes her dangerous. She isn't as overtly powerful as Lady Dimitrescu or the rest of the lords from a physical standpoint, but she more than makes up for it with her intelligence. Not only is she capable of engineering some wildly powerful hallucinogens, but she's also a whiz at crafting puzzles and traps. Knowing she can't handle her confrontation with him head-on, Donna lures Ethan to her state and locks him inside. To get out, the hero has to solve a series of increasingly difficult puzzles, all while avoiding a monster that can end his life should he venture too close to it. To touch further on how intelligent and dangerous Donna really is, we can look to the mental gymnastics that she puts Ethan through during their encounter. She starts by offering the potential of saving his daughter, only to rip it away seconds later. She then locks him in a twisted maze-like doll workshop, located beneath the Beneviento estate. From there, she attacks Ethan mentally with hallucinations, thoughts of self-doubt, and visions of grotesque versions of his family. She's a master of mental manipulation, drawing off of Ethan's deepest fears, and using them to quite literally scare him to death. When Mother Miranda gave Donna Beneviento the gift of the Kado, she immediately realized that she could use its parasitic influence to control things. Rather than control and infect other people, Donna once again drew on her previous experiences and isolated herself from the world, choosing to influence inanimate objects and plants instead. By spreading the parasitic Kadu around, she's able to take over and manipulate dolls, almost like ghostly possession. The Kadu will also cling to plants, allowing Donna to fill the air with spores. Anyone who inhales these spores or comes in contact with them can then be influenced by the twisted doll maker. A major side effect of the Kadu in her bloodstream is psychosis, which makes her unpredictable. Those who traveled to House Beneviento were already expecting Donna to transform into a massive, grotesque creature. After all, any players who gains access to her house would have to pass through a mutated Lady Dimitrescu to get there. But the lonely doll maker doesn't actually have a second transformation, even though each of the lords after her encounter do. She's the only one that doesn't show her true power, and it's unclear if that's because she lacks the ability to do so or because Ethan dispatches her before she has a chance to transform. One hint that Donna may not be as closely related to the other lords as first thought is the fact that she doesn't drop crystallized remains when defeated. Those who beat Lady Dimitrescu will recall her dropping an elegant crystallized torso, and both Moreau and Heisenberg will drop crystallized remains when they perish. In fact, there are many enemies that Ethan will defeat throughout his journey that will leave behind some form of crystallized essence. Because of this, it's possible that Donna isn't as mutated as her counterparts. Those looking for a worthy reward will still receive Angie when Donna Beneviento falls, and the doll herself can be sold for a large sum of lei to the Duke. All of the lords and creatures found within Resident Evil Village are meant to represent classic horror tropes. The Dimitrescu clan are vampires, with a splash of bugs for good measure, and Morrow represents humanoid fish people, similar to the Lovecraftian horrors presented by H.P. Lovecraft. There are even werewolves running amok throughout the town. So it's no surprise that Donna Beneviento was inspired by classic horror elements too, but she was originally meant to be something different. Her original concept design was dubbed Ghost, and it's easy to imagine that the developers were planning on making her a being from beyond the grave, considering she wears a black mourning dress. Her use of Kadu in controlling dolls is a nod to the ghostly theme of possession. Heisenberg is my favorite one in the village, and is also the most powerful of the four lords. He is a cool villain, and Ethan is invited to the factory by Heisenberg under the idea that Heisenberg has a possible deal to make. Though he seems hard to trust, Ethan makes his way to the factory and discovers Heisenberg's hideout. The large room is filled with rusted piles of metal and has a few items, but perhaps the most interesting piece of information can be found behind a large orange curtain. Players can crouch down to look at the board in some detail before a cut scene where Heisenberg rips parts of the board apart. On the board, they can see other lords with red X's over their portraits and pictures of Mia, Chris, and Rose. Interestingly, Mia's picture doesn't have an X over it, implying that Heisenberg himself knew that Mia Winters wasn't actually dead. Though this secret doesn't get revealed until the endgame, keen-eyed players will spot hints of this information early on through Heisenberg's info board. He is the Magneto of the village, who can control metals by his magnetostatic energy powers. He hates Mother Miranda for what she done to him and always wanted to kill her. He knew Chris Redfield, and also that he has punched a boulder. I think he has connections outside the village, and I also think that he is alive and can make a comeback in the future. And the final one is Morrow. He is the fusion creation of three men who are physicians, and is the most unstable one. I feel pity for him. He needs to prove something to Mother Miranda, and he is only one that lives in a rubble, and the other lords used to make fun of him, and he is more unstable, and can transform into a giant fish anytime. Morrow is a fish man who had heavy side effects during the implantation of the Kadu parasite. Mutations are central to the story of Resident Evil Village, just as much as the parasitic origins of mutations have been central to every Resident Evil game that came before it. However, things are a bit different in Village, because there are some very different mutations this time around. No longer are the Walking Dead the key enemies in the story. Neither is the kind of living zombies that were the bakers in Resident Evil 7. This time around, several of the monsters that popped up in Village were more closely tied to older monster lore, though they had their own Resident Evil twist. There are actually 3 different kinds of mutating compounds that play a part in Resident Evil Village. Megamycete, mold, and the Kadu parasite all contribute to the chaos that takes place in the game in very different ways. The Megamycete appears to be a kind of hive mind organism that can take over, or at least partially control, its host. The mold appears to be part of the Megamycete, so it's not entirely separate. Some characters in Village talk about it as though it's the fungus that allows the Megamycete to infect a host. Finally, the Kadu parasite is another offshoot of the Megamycete, but more central to Village. As Mother Miranda is responsible for most of the chaos of Resident Evil Village, it should come as no surprise that she is also responsible for the Kadu parasite. It seems as though she first discovered the Megamycete when she was wandering around in grief over the loss of her daughter. She came about a cave that served as a home for the organism and became infected. Miranda then decided to start experimenting with mold samples so she could better infect others. The other end goal for those experiments was to find a way to resurrect her daughter. During her experimentations with the mold, Miranda discovered it would be easier to make the mold take on the form of the Kadu parasite, meaning present or gift in Romanian. While many of the people infected with Kadu became lichens or other monstrosities, the 4 lords of Resident Evil Village had very different reactions to it. It's not entirely clear why those reactions were so different among those 4, but it's clear it's one of the reasons they remain near the top of the food chain in Village. Of the 4 lords of Resident Evil Village, it appears that the Kadu parasite allowed Dimitrescu to keep more of herself than even Morrow, Beneviento, and Heisenberg. This might be why she seemed especially close to Mother Miranda. Her transformation also shows how the Kadu parasite adapts and changes people quite differently. In Lady Dimitrescu's case, it accelerated and changed a blood disease she already had. That's both why she takes on the appearance of a vampire and the real reason she has to drink human blood. As the game shows, each of Mother Miranda's lords does find a way to control the Kadu parasite, even as they are all changed differently. The one big question left unanswered about the Kadu parasite is, Why do some seem completely under the influence of the parasite, while others seem to bond with it? As Dimitrescu, Moreau, Beneviento and Heisenberg are able to do. In Resident Evil 7, protagonist Ethan Winters travels to Louisiana in search of his missing wife Mia, who was previously believed to be dead. Upon arrival, Ethan does manage to find Mia, but she has been infected with a black mold that makes her not quite human. In Resident Evil 7's canon ending, Ethan manages to cure Mia, and the two of them escape from the Baker family plantation with the help of Chris Redfield. In the years between Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village, Ethan and Mia have resumed their married life, having moved to Europe at the behest of Redfield. Ethan has received some combat training to better protect himself in case he ever winds up in a similar situation that he was in during the events of RE7. They seem to be having a fairly normal life, though there is some tension over the events that happened in Resident Evil 7. One of the biggest questions going into Resident Evil Village's launch was why Chris Redfield shot Mia. As it so happens, Chris Redfield didn't really shoot Mia. It's revealed near the end of the game that the Mia Winters Chris shot at the beginning wasn't the real Mia at all, but rather Mother Miranda. It seems Mother Miranda has the ability to shapeshift, and so she took Mia's form in an effort to get closer to Rose, winning her trust and making it easier to transfer her dead daughter Eva into Rose's body. Chris and his team became aware that Ethan wasn't living with the real Mia, and so they launched an operation to take her out. Unfortunately, it seems as though their attempt at killing Mother Miranda failed. She simply took the form of a corpse to trick Chris and his team, then popped back up in the transport vehicle, leaving it a wreck as she made off with Rose. However, this left everyone wondering the whereabouts of the real Mia Winters. While Ethan Winters is out fighting Mother Miranda's lords and trying to put his daughter back together, Mia is presumed dead. However, when Chris Redfield reaches Mother Miranda's lab, he finds Mia in a cell. As it turns out, Mother Miranda kept Mia alive so that she could conduct experiments on her. Considering Mia's exposure to the black mold during Resident Evil 7, and how she is Rose's real mother, it makes sense that Mother Miranda would want to see if she could learn anything else from Mia. Chris manages to free Mia from her cell, and then he tells her that Mother Miranda killed Ethan. However, Mia then reveals to Chris that Ethan is special, and it is unlikely that Miranda actually succeeded in killing him. This entire time, Mia was aware that Ethan had been transformed by the black mold. In fact, Ethan was killed at the very beginning of Resident Evil 7 by Jack Baker, but the black mold essentially brought him back to life and gave him incredible regenerative abilities. That is why Ethan is able to sustain such significant punishment in the Resident Evil games yet somehow stay alive. Since he knows Ethan is alive, Chris then sets out to help him in his fight against Mother Miranda. Miranda is able to block Chris off for most of the battle, but Ethan still manages to give her a serious run for her money. Ethan succeeds in killing Mother Miranda, but the fight costs him his life as well, and so he entrusts Rose with Chris. Ethan then stays behind so Rose and Chris can escape while he sacrifices himself to destroy the Megamycete, a heart-like, fleshy thing that created the black mold in the first place. During all of this, Chris had his team evacuate Mia to a helicopter. Chris and Rose make it back to the helicopter, and Chris hands Rose over to Mia. Mia is upset when she finds out that Ethan is not coming, but ultimately there is nothing she can do about it. The explosion then confirms Ethan's demise and Mia is taken away from the area, presumably to safety. Following Resident Evil Village's ending is an after-credits scene that shows a teenage Rose. If Rose ages like a normal person, then there should be a time jump that will age Mia up a little bit as well. Whether or not she will have a role to play in the inevitable Resident Evil 9 remains to be seen. Much of Resident Evil Village's marketing revolved around Lady Dimitrescu and her castle. But once the full game was out, it was clear that her time in the game was relatively short, and she was an underling to the true villain of the story, Mother Miranda. Anyone that has completed Resident Evil Village, and has made sure to read most of the files in the game can attest that Mother Miranda is hugely important. Not only does she serve as the primary antagonist in Resident Evil Village itself, but Miranda has a far-reaching impact on the Resident Evil franchise as a whole. In fact, even though she has only ever appeared in one game, the argument can be made that Mother Miranda is one of the most important characters in the entire series. Mother Miranda has an impact in Resident Evil Village from the very first scene, though fans won't realize it until much later. It's revealed that Mother Miranda has shape-shifting abilities, and is essentially able to transform herself into anyone that she wants. Miranda uses this ability throughout Resident Evil Village, perhaps most notably using it to take the place of Mia Winters at the beginning of the game. While posing as Mia Winters, Mother Miranda is able to get close to Ethan's daughter Rose, who she plans on using to resurrect her own daughter who died from the Spanish flu. Chris Redfield and his team then swarm Ethan's house, shooting Mia to death, and believing that they have succeeded in killing Mother Miranda. However, Miranda merely shape-shifted into the form of a corpse, later reanimating herself to successfully kidnap Rose. Miranda has a presence throughout the rest of Resident Evil Village. She can be seen talking to her four lords, who reign over specific regions near the titular village, and Ethan also witnesses her killing one of the villagers in a field. The mysterious old woman that talks to Ethan throughout the game is revealed to be Mother Miranda in disguise, and eventually Ethan fights Mother Miranda in a one-on-one battle. Miranda defeats Ethan in their first battle and believes him dead, so she heads off to complete the ritual. However, Ethan's regenerative abilities help him stay alive long enough to fight Miranda yet again. Ethan defeats Miranda in this second fight, but it takes too much out of him, and so Ethan Winters dies as well. Taking a look at Resident Evil Village by itself, it's already clear why Mother Miranda is hugely important. She is directly involved with most of the major plot beats, and she also causes the death of new Resident Evil protagonist Ethan Winters. This will undoubtedly have huge ramifications on the Resident Evil franchise's story moving forward, so Mother Miranda's impact should be felt long after Resident Evil Village's conclusion. Resident Evil Village is the latest game in the Resident Evil timeline, but Mother Miranda's influence actually predates the original. While playing as Chris Redfield late in Resident Evil Village, fans come across a letter that was written by none other than Oswell E. Spencer. For those that may not remember, Spencer was the founder of Umbrella, and the one who originated the research into the T-virus. Spencer is also responsible for building the mansion that the first Resident Evil game takes place in, so he is hugely important to Resident Evil's lore. However, if there was never a Mother Miranda, there would never have been an Oswell E. Spencer. In the letter, it comes to light that Mother Miranda mentored Spencer, and is ultimately the one that influenced him to create the Umbrella Corporation and develop the T-virus. It's also revealed that Spencer and Miranda explored a cave together where they found the Umbrella symbol, which Spencer would later adopt as the symbol of his company. This new information makes Mother Miranda easily one of the most important characters in the entire Resident Evil franchise. Without Mother Miranda's influence on Spencer, the events of the first Resident Evil game would have never taken place. This means that Miranda is essentially responsible for the entire Resident Evil storyline. With Mother Miranda being such a hugely important character in the Resident Evil mythos, it will be interesting to see how the villain is topped in the inevitable Resident Evil 9 game. Resident Evil Village introduced several new antagonists and types of enemies. Whether it was the iconic Lady Dimitrescu or her Leakin underlings that terrorized the nearby village, there was no shortage of unique enemies in the latest entry. Naturally, the new monsters are the product of a modified parasite. This is how Resident Evil Village's new Leakin enemies come to exist and terrorize Ethan Winters as he searches for his daughter Rose. The werewolf-like creatures fit some classic horror archetypes, but their parasitic origins are what connects them to the overall Resident Evil canon as well. Resident Evil Village has already drawn impressive numbers, naturally leading to fans digging deep into the new backstories for both main characters and enemies. The Lycans are the product of yet another new parasite, called the Kado. Mother Miranda, now ultimately the passive catalyst for the events of the entire Resident Evil franchise, created the Kado by experimenting with the mold. Introduced in Resident Evil 7, the mold is an engineered fungus that can both enhance and mutate individuals. This refined mutation of the mold is what's caused the creation of the Lycans in Resident Evil Village. Mother Miranda's research would impact the later experiments by Umbrella that fuel the events of Resident Evil as a whole. The Kado that she would later go on to create infects humans in a way that makes them powerful enemies. Humans changed into lichens become physically more powerful and mutate into the werewolf-like creatures encountered in Resident Evil Village. However, as is a trend in the engineered organisms throughout Resident Evil, the lichens maintain a level of intelligence high enough to follow orders and wield rudimentary weapons. Altogether, these lichens are intelligent and powerful enough to terrorize Ethan in groups. Keeping a level of intelligence enough to serve as guards and soldiers has been one of the primary focuses of the different bio-research done throughout Resident Evil. Much like the Las Plagas from Resident Evil 4, the mold and Kado also allow for the most powerful infected to communicate telepathically with other infected, in essence creating a kind of hive mind among the infected. This explains how Miranda and the other more powerful infected are able to control the lichens to do their bidding with little resistance. Much like the other types of viruses and parasites throughout Resident Evil, the lichens in RE Village also take different forms. There are more generic lichens that often travel in packs, but some adapt greater physical or mental prowess, allowing some to wield massive melee weapons or even bows. After Ethan Winters successfully defeats Mother Miranda's 4 lords, he is confronted by Miranda herself. Despite his proven capabilities, Ethan is no match for Miranda, who rips out his heart and seemingly kills him. Chris Redfield sees this happen and finally launches an all-out assault with his team on the village in an effort to take out Miranda. BSAA, the organization that Chris used to work for in previous games, arrives on the scene as well. Chris manages to locate the Megamycete, which is a large, fleshy, heart-like object that gave Mother Miranda her abilities. Chris rigs the Megamycete with explosives, and then finds Miranda's lab. It's here where Chris finds Mia Winters and makes some startling revelations about how the events of Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village, and the black mold that came from the Megamycete, have long had an impact on the series' ongoing story. Ethan is rescued by the Duke, Resident Evil Village's take on RE4's Merchant, and has a final showdown with Mother Miranda. Ethan manages to defeat Miranda, but he is badly wounded in the fight and can no longer be saved by his black mold abilities. Realizing that he is going to die, Ethan entrusts Rose with Chris, who escapes with everyone on a helicopter. Ethan stays behind to detonate the bombs Chris planted on the Megamycete earlier, killing himself and destroying the village in the process. While escaping on the helicopter, Chris realizes that the BSAA soldiers that arrived were actually bioweapons. Enraged and confused, Chris then asks the helicopter to take them to the BSAA's headquarters in Europe, where he will presumably confront the organization and investigate why they are now apparently dealing with bioweapons. We are treated to a message that says the father's story is done, but there's still an after-credits scene to witness. At the very end of Resident Evil Village, players see a much older Rose visiting Ethan's grave. This version of Rose appears to be a teenager, suggesting that there was a time skip of some kind after the end of Resident Evil Village, though considering Rose's black mold abilities, it's also possible that she simply ages faster than regular people. It seems Rose's abilities are being utilized by Chris Redfield and whatever organization he works for because she is taken away from Ethan's grave to go on a mission. She makes mention that Chris doesn't know all of her capabilities, though it seems as though we will have to wait until the next game to find out more. Those who have finished Resident Evil Village know that the game ends with a very interesting post-credits sequence, leaving one big mystery in players' laps as the screen fades to black. The post-credits features a young woman, revealed to be Ethan Winters' now-grown daughter Rose, visiting her father's grave. She then gets into a vehicle and is driven away, only to be stopped by a mysterious figure who is never revealed until now. With the help of a photo mode mod, Resident Evil Village players have been able to see for themselves who the mysterious figure is. The Resident Evil Village mod from Otis_INF allows the player to detach the camera from third person and float around the scene, both as the scene continues to play or with the scene paused. This way, instead of watching Rose's SUV drive off in the distance, the player can zoom into what's happening and see the mysterious figure for themselves. The surprise reveal is that the figure is none other than Ethan Winters himself walking down the road. Despite it being well over a decade after Ethan Winters' death, here he is again, unaged, hands still remained, in the same outfit as players left him even after he gave his jacket to baby Rose and Chris Redfield. With one mystery solved, another has clearly risen to take its place. there is a question to be asked about the validity of this reveal. It's possible that Capcom never intended for the mysterious figure's identity to be revealed, or that Capcom is intentionally out to trick anyone who breaks the game to see the character's face. After all, Ethan from however many years ago showing up isn't just a crazy revelation, it's also pretty silly. Still, in the logic of Resident Evil Village, Ethan showing up is absolutely possible. Since Ethan's made out of mold, he could be brought back in any form at any time, so long as the mold survives. Perhaps the bigger mystery isn't whether Ethan's alive, but what's happened with the mold. But that's a question for another Resident Evil game to answer. There are many more mysteries to uncover, as the Resident Evil Village ending sees Chris Redfield rescue Ethan's daughter Rose and wife Mia Winters. As Ethan blows up the Megamycete, which is where the black mold from Resident Evil 7 came from, Chris, Rose, Mia, and the surviving members of Chris's team manage to escape on a helicopter. On the helicopter ride, however, Chris comes to a rather startling realization. When Chris Redfield and his team attacked the village to take out Mother Miranda, they noticed that the BSAA had arrived on the scene as well. For those who may be unfamiliar, the BSAA is the organization in the Resident Evil universe that has traditionally fought back against bioweapons, and Chris himself used to be a part of it. However, it is revealed that the soldiers that the BSAA sent in to deal with the Mother Miranda situation were actually bioweapons themselves. As one might imagine, this angers Chris, and so he asks the helicopter pilot to make a beeline straight to the BSAA headquarters in Europe. It's quite possible that the inevitable Resident Evil 9 will show fans what happened when Chris arrived at the BSAA headquarters, as well as provide some further explanation as to why the organization dedicated to eradicating bioweapons are now using them for their own gain. Another possibility is that Resident Evil 9 will swerve players and once again feature Ethan Winters in the starring role. While Ethan Winters seemingly died at the end of Resident Evil Village, there is some evidence that Capcom may be planning on bringing him back, though it seems highly unlikely. Basically, a Resident Evil Village photo mode mod has allowed users to zoom in on a mysterious figure that approaches Rose at the very end of the game, and that figure looks exactly like Ethan Winters' character model. The more likely explanation is that Capcom didn't want to create a brand new character model for such a small moment, and so it just reused Ethan's. However, Ethan has been shown to have incredible regenerative abilities, and there is a tendency for Resident Evil characters to not stay dead. Even so, Resident Evil Village claimed that the father's story is done, and so fans shouldn't get their hopes up that Ethan will somehow come back for the next game. While Resident Evil 9 will likely continue the story from where Resident Evil Village left off, it's likely that there will be other Resident Evil games released between now and then. Reputable leakers have suggested that a Resident Evil Switch exclusive game is in development, possibly for release this year, and beyond that, the Resident Evil 4 remake is also expected to launch within the next couple of years. Whatever Resident Evil 9 is going to be, it is going to feature Rose in some capacity. If not, then Village's ending doesn't make much sense. Rose could turn into another damsel in distress with Chris trying to rescue her, but that's not exactly the most progressive direction. The star of the next game is debatable, but here is something worth chewing on. The 9th installment may take place in California, a clue that comes from Rose's. Additionally, Ethan originally was from LA. It would make sense to see him buried there in a family plot, instead of in Texas where he used to live with Mia. As for exactly where this game takes place, players have a few clues. Fans have determined it could be Romania. This is based on the money in the game, which is called lei, the plural of Romania's leu currency. Some words also come from the Romanian language. For example, the Cadou parasite translates to gift. Transylvania would fit with the game's general theme, since it's home to the classic Dracula stories. Ethan is perhaps the most perplexing main character in the series. Firstly, he barely has any reactions to the most bizarre things that he sees in his adventures. He's not completely silent, but outside of cutscenes, he barely says a word. Furthermore, what exactly is his body made of, if he is dead but still a mold person? Shouldn't he have gone crazy like the bakers, or shown some sort of wear and tear? There are too many questions left lingering in players' minds. Now that he's dead, they will probably never be answered. Another thing to be answered, that where does this Mutamycete come from, and it was let down for the village, that the story did not dive deeper into the ancients of the village and the origin of the original four lords. The puzzles are a little bit janky, and the relation between Spencer and Miranda is just downplayed, as it is mentioned he only copied the symbol. The easy answer to this is from space. For as many directions as this series has gone, space is one frontier it has avoided. Resident Evil may avoid it completely, considering that another Capcom series that tried it, Dino Crisis, failed miserably. But if not from space, where could this sentient heart-like organism have come from? Hell? That's walking into Doom territory right there. For now, the Megamycete's origins remain a mystery. It's been nearly a month since Capcom released Resident Evil Village, but it's still riding high thanks to its perfectly balanced horror gameplay, and of course, to the rise in popularity of Lady Dimitrescu. Now, it appears that the latest installment to the long-standing survival horror franchise is shaping up to be one of the biggest games of 2021. Although most players are probably still finding their way out of the village, many have already finished everything Resident Evil Village offers. While Resident Evil Re-verse still doesn't have an exact launch date, the big question now is, will Capcom release DLC content for Resident Evil Village? Although there are still no official plans from Capcom for a DLC expansion for Resident Evil Village, it is worth noting that additional content outside of Resident Evil Re-verse is inevitable. Looking at the franchise's recent history, it is worth remembering that 2017's Resident Evil 7 saw the release of two DLC expansions, Not a Hero and End of Zoe. For the uninitiated, while both Not a Hero and End of Zoe are DLCs, their stories are of great significance to the plot of Resident Evil 7, with the former explaining the involvement of Chris Redfield in the Baker incident and the latter delving into how the Baker family succumbed to the mold. Given that Resident Evil 7 is closely tied to Resident Evil Village, with both games sharing the same protagonist, it is likely that Capcom is planning to release a couple of DLCs to expand the main game story. Additionally, 2019's remake of Resident Evil 2 also saw the release of several DLCs. While the DLCs weren't an extension of Resident Evil 2's story, they were able to provide players with something to do after completing the main game. However, unlike Resident Evil 7 and 2, the Resident Evil 3 remake did not receive any additional content, apart from Resident Evil Resistance, which was included with every purchase of the main game. Interestingly enough, while a DLC for Resident Evil Village is likely to happen, one can't help but see a possible pattern with Resident Evil 3. Both titles feature a standalone minigame, with Resident Evil 3 having Resident Evil Resistance and Resident Evil Re-verse for Resident Evil Village. In a way, it could be possible that Resident Evil Village won't receive a DLC, given that Re-verse could serve this purpose similar to RE3. However, it is worth noting that while also seen as a success by Capcom, the remake of Resident Evil 3 received mixed reviews, which is probably why Capcom didn't bother to develop a DLC for it. In contrast, Resident Evil Village received mostly positive reviews from both players and critics, increasing its chances of receiving story expansions from Capcom similar to Resident Evil 7. A recent report has unearthed what seems to be some artwork from the Resident Evil Village DLC Trauma Pack, which reveals that fan favorite of the series, Ada Wong, may have originally been planned to make an appearance in the game, but was cut at the last minute. The artwork shows a concept drawing of Ada donned in a Plague Doctor costume whilst holding a crossbow. There's also some storyboard drawings which depict her in action, bursting into rooms and firing on unsuspecting enemies. Resident Evil games see Ada Wong as a badass to the series, often depicted wearing a red dress and popping up unexpectedly over the course of the story. Her part in RE8 was allegedly going to have her save Ethan, with Ada investigating the goings-on in the village. However, according to captions in the concept art, her part was cut due to conflicting scenarios. It's been revealed that she would have been disguised in her Plague outfit before rescuing Ethan from his trial. Despite the franchise carrying weight by itself, much of the focus during the marketing process has been on the game's matriarchal figure, the 9-foot Lady Dimitrescu. Although a towering villain who stalks Ethan throughout sections of the game, Lady Dimitrescu has become something of a meme since her announcement, taking the internet by storm, with many fans intrigued by her lofty appearance. She continues Capcom's trend of including an imposing antagonist in the Resident Evil world who appears throughout the game at various intervals to chase down the protagonist. Prior to the game's release, a timed demo of Resident Evil Village was released which allowed players to explore some of the village parts and some of the castle interior of the game in 60 minutes or less. Many were left heartily impressed by what they saw and played, and if early reviews are anything to go by, the game is likely to go down a treat. Even without Ada being added to it. Ada Wong occupies a strange, fluid space in the Resident Evil canon. Almost always working in her own self-interest, Ada might be seen as a temporary ally when the going gets tough, but she is always sure to have an escape route, and usually gets what she is after. Ada has had some truly memorable moments in the Resident Evil franchise, and her capricious nature keeps fans guessing as to what side she is on. That chameleon aspect to her character means she can fit in just about anywhere in a Resident Evil game, and surely she could have worked as a character in Resident Evil Village, but now that it is known that she was cut, what impact does that decision have? Resident Evil's universe has a tendency to connect its characters in any way possible. The lore of the game's creating a convoluted web that ensnares the protagonists. Tangling them up in some way with Umbrella, or a rebel faction spun off from the pharmaceutical giant, the game's up to and including Resident Evil 6 upped the ante constantly, with increasingly outrageous connections to one another. Resident Evil 7 and Village have taken a different approach, with a new protagonist and very minimal connections to the lore of previous entries. For that reason, letting these installments breathe on their own and tell a story that relies less on franchise staples is a positive. Ethan's story, and the arc told through Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village, is compelling enough to not need to use the crutch of fanservice to heighten the experience. Though it does seem like more connections to the larger Resident Evil universe could be looming. Another reason why removing Ada from the game was the right call, is that while Ada's allegiance is always shifting, and she could turn up anywhere, she has not made many appearances when Leon Kennedy is not involved. Her strange link to the Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 4, and Resident Evil 6 protagonist could be one of the reasons why she was ultimately cut from Village. Finding a way to tie her into a story not involving Leon might have proven too difficult, particularly in a game with few ties to the greater Resident Evil lore. Shoehorning Ada in just because fans like to see her would have been a misstep. With that said, there could be a case made to include someone like Ada in Resident Evil Village, something that very nearly happened if she hadn't been cut at the 11th hour. With Chris Redfield already involved in Ethan's story, it is clear that Resident Evil 7 and Village don't take place in a bubble, or an alternate universe. Umbrella, or the remnants of Umbrella, exists in this world, and bioweapons are still sought after, so there are parties that still want to do evil things with weird biological experiments, and Ada is certainly one to facilitate that. The missed opportunity here is in establishing that connection to previous installments in the franchise, as Village slowly tries to link its story to Resident Evil lore. Ada is a very useful character for bringing out the behind-the-scenes narrative that runs through most Resident Evil games. In both Ada's RE4 and RE6 campaigns, she charts her own course, and reveals key details that connect the main story to the forces behind all the madness. Similarly, Ada could have played that role in Village, showing up nominally in the main story, but more extensively in the shadows. Having Claire Redfield or Jill Valentine make an appearance would have been too much fanservice, and ultimately would have acted as a distraction from Ethan's story. But Ada is a character that could have been featured without feeling too intrusive. Her plague doctor look in the Village artwork indicates that she likely would have been undercover, perhaps a mystery character before a big reveal at a key moment. She could have collected a Caduce sample and taken off, having acquired what her client requested. It would have been in character, and not pulled the focus from Ethan too hard. While some fans are likely disappointed that Ada was cut from Resident Evil Village, the decision makes sense. Chris already provides enough connective tissue to the Resident Evil universe, and Ethan's story is strong enough to not need more hooks and swerves. With that said, of all the Resident Evil characters to possibly show up, Ada would have been one that could have worked. Like Resident Evil 7, this game leaves many unanswered questions on the fans. In fact, the epilogue itself raises some huge questions not just about Resident Evil Village's conclusion, but the series as a whole. Of the questions out there though, there are 6 that could be immediately explored through DLC. Capcom was pretty good about their support after the original launch of Resident Evil 7, so hopefully, that trend will continue with this game. Some of these DLC ideas will be obvious and ones that will almost 100% happen. Some of Chris' soldiers died during the transportation of Ethan, Rose, and Miranda. The majority of his main squad survived though, and what they were doing after this incident is questionable. The first time players meet up with him again is in Morrow's territory, which is about halfway through the game. What exactly were they doing before this during the events Ethan was taking care of? They gave Chris DLC the first time with Resident Evil 7, so it'll probably happen again for this. His mission toward the end of the game was like Call of Duty plus Werewolves, which was a nice change of pace to the game. It wasn't scary, but it was cool, so more of that type of action for DLC may make fans happy. Something that might be more interesting to explore with Chris could be a standalone game, or a giant DLC expansion. What was his team doing during the 3 years between this game and Resident Evil 7? Was he watching Miranda? If that's true, then it wouldn't make sense for him to have sent Ethan and Mia to this foreign country where this evil lurked. This DLC could then explore the connections and their mold experiments further, which would be a good way to flesh out this new lore while tying things back to Resident Evil Village. Something had to have been going on with his team on some big level. He mentions it to himself when looking at his phone before that final mission starts. What exactly did he go through? For that matter, where is every other beloved Resident Evil character in the series? Is he it? For most of the series, Umbrella was the bad organization while the BSAA was the good organization. This all changed in Resident Evil 7, wherein players were introduced to Blue Umbrella, a rebranding of the company to set itself apart. The BSAA took part in this rescue operation, making it seem like they were still good. However, in this game, it is revealed they were using bioweapons. Who is in charge of the BSAA now, and what exactly went down during their operation? One theory could point to a cut character, Ada Wong. She is known for underhanded tactics in the series, and was a big character to cut. Repurposing her for DLC as part of the BSAA could make sense though. Someone from this series besides Chris has to appear at some point. Who else could be in charge of the BSAA and be evilish if not Ada? It turns out that Heisenberg has not been happy with Miranda for a long time. That's why he was creating an army in the background. Not for Miranda, but for an uprising. Was he doing anything else shady? Maybe he took on other missions to undermine some of Miranda's other plans. Perhaps he had a Captain Toad situation and placed items across this game in order to help Ethan out. Either way, some DLC with him would be great. The villagers all seem to revere Miranda. This is especially apparent when the rest of the town gathers together and prays. It seems like Miranda did take some sacrifices now and again, but for the most part, the village thrived with her in charge. What changed to make her turn? Was it just because she found Rose and didn't need to experiment anymore? Some DLC exploring this village, like with a new character being sacrificed and trying to escape, could be cool, like some of Resident Evil VII's side mission tapes. Another piece of content Capcom could look at for inspiration would be the Maiden demo. That was someone other than Ethan trapped in the castle, and it worked for a small puzzle game. Lady Dimitrescu is impossible to kill. That is until players enter the cathedral, where there is a corpse holding a silver dagger. This dagger was made of silver and is combined with every poison that is being collected across all of Romania. More importantly, who was in the coffin carrying it? It would be interesting if Capcom tried to make some Castlevania-like DLC. Maybe this was a vampire hunter that met his untimely end on the premises in the castle. Why would she keep his body around though? It doesn't make sense, but DLC could certainly try to answer that riddle. After all, Chris Redfield is back. I got goosebumps when I was playing as Chris Redfield again. The village is good. I am a lore addict, and when I play game, I jump into the universe and I merge with the characters in the universe, and I cannot wait to unravel the mysteries. And that's all for the video, guys. Like and share the video for a greater audience. Comment your thoughts on the topics, and if you want to contribute for the growth of the channel, the link to my PayPal in the video's description and in the channel banner. As my resources are very limited, donations are always appreciated, and it can help me to create more contents and share news consistently, and could open doors for live streams, game playthroughs, podcasts, merch, etc. Thanks for watching the video, subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon, and until then from SMPV it's goodbye.
This is a bioweapon.
What the hell were they thinking?
Orders, Captain.
Pick up the rest of the squad. Plot a course for BSAA Europe HQ. Someone's gotta pay.